After everything they had been through, harsh opposition, silent fears that lingered in the background, CEO Toan and Ly Tu Diem finally held hands and stepped into the most important day of their lives. Surrounded by the peaceful scenery of the Highlands, their small wooden house was decorated with wildflowers and simple handmade fabric ribbons. Their wedding was not luxurious, but it was filled with sincerity, warmth, and the genuine love of their neighbors, who had come together to help them create this special day. From the very first light of dawn touching the endless mountain ranges, the entire village seemed to awaken into a different atmosphere. It was no longer the usual quiet stillness, but a lively harmony of laughter, hurried footsteps, and excited voices. Today was not just any ordinary day. It was the wedding of Toan and Ly Tu Diem. A simple wedding, yet one that carried all the hope, faith, and love that the villagers had for two people who had overcome countless hardships to stand here together at this very moment. Even the mountains seemed to understand, as the thin layers of morning mist faded more quickly than usual, making way for gentle sunlight that spread across the valley. Early in the morning, the women of the village gathered in front of the small wooden house. Each person naturally took on a task without needing to be assigned. Some arranged colorful wildflowers into old glass bottles, others hung hand-dyed fabric strips along the roof edges, the soft fabric swaying gently in the wind, creating a beauty that was simple yet full of life. In one corner of the yard, a group of women prepared food over small fires. The smell of smoke blended with the scent of earth, wood, and morning dew, forming an atmosphere so warm that anyone stepping into it could feel the comfort immediately. This atmosphere was completely different from luxurious weddings in the city, where everything is arranged by money and services. Here, every small detail was created by the hands and hearts of the people. They were not just attending the wedding. They were part of it, contributing to something meaningful, as if they were protecting something pure and precious. The men of the village were just as involved. They built extra tables and chairs from familiar wooden planks, repaired the roof, secured the strings of hanging lights, and even carefully cleaned each bowl and cup. Though none of these items were perfect, it was precisely that imperfection that made everything feel more genuine, more intimate. In the midst of all this activity, the once simple wooden house had transformed into something new, not glamorous or dazzling, but warm, welcoming, and deeply human. Inside the house, Tu Diem sat in front of a small mirror. Soft light streamed through the window, making the space feel calm and gentle. Around her were several older women from the village, helping her fix her hair and adjust her dress while chatting quietly. Their voices were soft but filled with care, like mothers and aunts preparing a daughter for her special day. The wedding dress she wore was not expensive or luxurious. It was simply a modest dress, altered from the one she had tried on in town. Yet when she wore it, it carried a unique beauty, not because of the fabric or design, but because of her expression, her smile, and everything she had gone through to wear it today. Tu Diem looked at herself in the mirror, her hands gently tightening. There was a slight tremble in her eyes, a trace of nervousness, as if she still couldn't fully believe that this moment was real. She softly asked, almost whispering, "Do I look okay?" One of the women behind her smiled warmly and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Not just okay, you are beautiful." Those simple words gave Tu Diem strength. She nodded lightly, and a soft smile appeared on her face, subtle, but enough to brighten her entire expression. Outside in the yard, Toan stood among the men, sleeves rolled up, helping them finish the last preparations. Sweat formed lightly on his forehead, but he didn't seem to notice. His heart was filled not with exhaustion, but with anticipation and a kind of nervous excitement he had never felt before. No one would have imagined that a man who once stood at the peak of power could blend so naturally into such a simple life. But for Toan, this was not a sacrifice, it was a choice. A choice he had never regretted. When the ceremony began, the villagers gathered together. There was no loud music, no stage, just a small cleared yard in front of the house. Yet it was this simplicity that made everything feel more real, more connected. Toan stood at the front, dressed neatly but simply, his eyes constantly turning toward the door, knowing that in just a few seconds, the woman he loved would walk out. And then, that moment arrived. The door slowly opened. Tu Diem stepped outside, her movements gentle and graceful. The wedding dress swayed softly with each step, sunlight touching her figure and making her seem to glow within the simple setting. For a brief second, all sounds seemed to fade. Every eye turned toward her. But in Toan's world, only she existed. He stood still, unable to move, unable to speak, afraid that if he blinked, the moment would disappear. As she walked closer, the distance between them shortened to just a few steps. But to Toan, it felt like the entire journey they had walked together. When they finally stood face to face, no words were needed. No elaborate ceremony. Just their eyes, just their presence. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment when they thought they couldn't go on, all of it came together in this single moment. Toan gently took her hand. Her hand was small but warm. He held it firmly, as if to say he would never let go again. His voice was calm but clear. "I don't have much to promise. But I will never let go of you." Tu Diem looked at him, tears softly falling, yet her smile remained. She nodded. "Me too." Applause broke out, not loud, but enough to fill the space. People smiled, congratulated them, and joy spread through the air. It was not a grand celebration, but it touched every heart present. The celebration afterward was filled with warmth. People ate together, shared stories, laughed freely. Children ran around the yard, adults raised cups in celebration. There was no distance, no separation, everyone felt like one big family. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, the light turned into a warm golden hue. Toan and Tu Diem quietly stepped to the back of the house, where it was more peaceful, away from the crowd. A gentle breeze passed through, carrying the scent of the mountains, the life they had built together. "Do you regret it?" Toan asked softly. Tu Diem didn't hesitate. She shook her head and smiled. "Never." Toan looked at her, his gaze softening. Then he looked out toward the distant mountains stretching endlessly. In that moment, he realized that happiness was not something distant or grand, it was something simple, something small, yet enough to make a person feel complete. Tu Diem gently leaned her head on his shoulder. They stood there in silence, saying nothing more, simply enjoying the rare moment when everything felt exactly as it should be. And in that moment, their love needed no proof. Its existence alone was enough. As the evening deepened, the village slowly transitioned into a softer rhythm. The laughter became quieter, the conversations more intimate, and the warm glow of small hanging lights began to replace the fading sunlight. One by one, the lanterns that had been carefully prepared earlier were lit, casting a golden shimmer across the wooden house, the yard, and the surrounding hills. The entire space felt like a dream, simple, fragile, yet incredibly real. Toan and Tu Diem eventually returned to the celebration, greeted by cheerful smiles and teasing remarks from the villagers. Some of the elders raised their cups again, offering blessings not just for happiness, but for strength, for the kind of strength that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Because deep down, everyone understood that love alone was not always enough, it needed courage, patience, and the will to protect it. At one corner of the yard, a group of young people began playing music using handmade instruments. The melody was raw, imperfect, but full of life. It echoed softly into the mountains, blending with the night air. Without hesitation, a few villagers began to dance, their movements free and unrestrained. Soon, laughter rose again, louder this time, as others joined in. Toan looked at Tu Diem and extended his hand. No words were needed. She smiled. And she took it. They stepped into the small circle of people, moving slowly at first, almost shyly, but gradually finding their rhythm. There was no choreography, no perfect timing, just two people moving together, guided by something deeper than music. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no past chasing them, no future threatening them. Only the present. Only this. Only them. Later that night, when most of the guests had returned home and the lights began to dim, the village fell back into a quiet stillness. The mountains stood silent once again, as if guarding the memories of the day. Inside the small wooden house, everything felt different. Not because it had changed, but because now, it belonged to both of them in a new way. Tu Diem gently placed her wedding dress aside, her fingers lingering on the fabric for a moment, as if she didn't want to let go of the feeling it carried. Toan stood nearby, watching her, a quiet smile forming on his face, not one of excitement, but of peace. For the first time in a long while, there were no expectations, no pressure, no need to prove anything. Just silence. And understanding. He stepped closer, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "It was worth it," he said softly. Tu Diem looked up at him, her eyes calm, steady. Everything was. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint echoes of laughter from earlier that day, as if the village itself was still celebrating. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the quiet mountains and the fading lights, the future waited. Uncertain. Unpredictable. But no longer frightening. Because this time, they would face it together.